I was born in the early 1960s, and I got to say, I feel very, very fortunate, very blessed that I grew up in the time I did. I feel like, I don't know, for a lot of reasons, the 60s and 70s, that was just a great era to be a kid. You know, certainly to be a teenager in the 70s, I thought was ideal. And the other thing I feel very, very blessed about was, you know, all four of my grandparents were 100% Greek, you know, emigrated to this country through Ellis Island during the turn of the 20th century, during the, you know, the new wave of immigration when a lot of Greeks and Italians and Jews and Russians came in, a lot of Southern Europeans and Eastern Europeans. You know, all four of my grandparents, you know, Greek was their primary language. Three of them emigrated from Greece. My other grandmother, my Yaya means grandmother in Greek, Yaya Fofa, she was raised largely in Egypt, where a lot of the sort of wealthier Greeks were from. We used to say she was the aristocrat grandparent. Supposedly she spoke 7 languages. So I'm sure she spoke many. I don't know if she spoke all 7. But both of my parents were born here. They didn't even visit Greece until they were elderly. So they were, you know, in every way brought up in the United States, but they were extremely committed to raising my brother, my sister, and myself in the Greek culture. And they did. You know, my mom used to always say to me, you know, Spencer, first and foremost, you're Greek. Don't ever forget that. You are Greek. And, you know, I'm grateful that she did that. You know, because the reality is, you know, if you're, you know, born in this country, to parents who were born in this country, you know, your life is going to be, your day-to-day life is going to be very American. You know, most of my friends, with the exception of my friends from church, they're all American. So, you know, the fact that my parents made such an effort to surround us with the Greek culture, I think was a really good thing. And it just made for, and I kind of felt like that made us sort of the consummate Americans, which is, you know, the vast majority of Americans are, you know, relatives of or descendants from folks who came from other countries. And, you know, we're all here in the melting pot and assimilating into the American culture. So anyway, given the time I was born and just sort of the Greek element, I feel like I really had an amazing childhood. And the day of the week, I have to say, I felt most Greek was definitely on Sundays. Sunday was family day. You know, my parents were religious, absolutely. But I won't say like Sunday, you know, the Sabbath day, keep it holy. So we just kind of sat and, you know, didn't do anything other than go to church and pray, whatever. It was really more about the family. Like that was a day you spend time with the family. You didn't really hang out with your friends much. And it always started with, you know, we got up, we had breakfast. You know, I have to say, the weekends we had special breakfast. You know, Monday through Friday, my mom didn't cook breakfast. You know, we had the same things. It was either, you know, Pop-Tarts. They had this variation of Pop-Tarts back in the 70s. They were called Danish Go-Rounds. They were basically the same ingredients as Pop-Tarts, but they were like molded into these oval shapes with like extra frosting, you know, or just cornflakes or toast and butter. Or she bought these, I don't even know if they still have them. Maybe they do. They're like these little boxes of all these different, you know, I think they were Kellogg cereals. It was like, you know, the variety pack. And there were like maybe like 16 of these, every little boxes of all different, you know, cereal. Or there was another one, it was like a strip. I forgot what that was called, a snack pack or something. You know, and they had like cornflakes and Raisin Bran and Fruit Loops and Apple Jacks and, you know, sugar frosted flakes. And well, back when you could still call them sugar frosted flakes. Now they're frosted flakes. Like they don't want to highlight the fact that they're just coated with sugar. And then there were always like a couple that nobody ever wanted to eat. Like one of them I remember was Product 19. You know, the cereal. I don't even know if they make that anymore, but I think the focus was Product 19 was like real healthy. You know, had all the nutrients and everything. But you know, we kids we never touched that one. The other one was shredded wheat, and it wasn't frosted shredded wheat. It was like these 2 little hay bales. So those never got eaten either. But, you know, so the weekends, you know, Sunday morning for sure, my mom would actually make something, bake something. We had, you know, back then they had these orange muffins. They were really good. or blueberry muffins. It was always either, Betty Crocker or Duncan Hines box mix, or my dad would make pancakes. So Sunday morning was special, and we got the Sunday morning newspaper with the funnies, and we'd all use that. And then we got ready for church. We didn't shower on Sunday morning. We bathed once a week. It was on Saturday night. And when I think about that now, it was kind of gross. I mean, we probably stunk, and even like the clothes. I mean, my mom ironed everything. She ironed socks and underwear and undershirts. So she spent a lot of time ironing. So she was very miserly with the clothes that you were allowed to like refresh on. So, we were allotted, one pair of underwear a week and one undershirt a week and maybe even one pair of socks a week. And then, of course, there were, you could sometimes get an extra pair of underwear like midweek if you had to. But that was kind of the rule. It was just different back then. People weren't quite so crazy about hygiene, especially, folks from, kind of grandparents who immigrated here. It was different. In retrospect, I don't think that was a good idea. I think we were kind of dirty. But anyway, so we would, get ready, always wore shirt and tie for the guys. My sister and my mom were in a dress. And then we would get in the car and we would head to church. And, church was definitely fun. The Greek Orthodox, church service is long. It's probably like a couple hours long. But, from the time you're 4 all the way through high school, if you're a kid in the Greek Orthodox Church, from September through June, you go to Sunday school. And, this was, the height of the baby boom. So what made it great was, your Sunday school classes, there were a ton of kids back then. There was just a lot of kids. So my class was anywhere from 30 to 40 kids. And we were wild. They had maybe, definitely one Sunday school teacher, sometimes two, but they could not control us. And, the kids, we would just be bouncing off the walls, and we had the best time. I feel bad for the teachers. Now, my mom was a Sunday school teacher. Eventually, when I was, maybe in like a senior high school, I was a Sunday school teacher. My brother, my sister, we all were. But my dad was like the Sunday school, I don't want to say administrator. He was kind of like the operations manager, and he was kind of like the IT department. So he would go from classroom to classroom, and he showed the films on, the religious films. But back then they didn't have, laptops with YouTube and, all the technology, so it wasn't, basically what they had was, it was a film strip, which, if you weren't around then, it's hard to understand what this is, but it's like, you had this machine and you'd put it in front of a screen, and they were just, it was like a strip of like, it looked like plastic, and each little frame was a different picture. And you'd put on the record player, the background that would narrate, and then it'd be beep, and then my dad would turn the little knob, and then you'd go to the next frame. So it wasn't even a motion picture. It was just like these like pictures on this film strip. So that was kind of my dad's job. He was also, kind of like the Sunday school custodian. So, whenever a kid would like throw up, and this happened to me once, I just barfed right in the middle of Sunday school, just barfed all over. My dad would come in with a bucket and the mop, and for some reason, it was surprising how many kids every now and then would throw up in the middle of Sunday school. So anyway, that was my dad's job. And again, church, it was fun, it was long, but afterwards we would then, get in the car and we would go to my grandmother's house. This was just part of the Sunday ritual. We would go to we wouldn't have lunch, but my Aunt Mary, my Thea, which means aunt in Greek, and my Theovangela, we'd all go with my mom and dad, my brother and sister and I, we'd all go to my grandmother's house. By that point, my papu, my grandfather, Papu George, had passed. And we would have, I guess it was like the little cocktail party, but it was like, 1 in the afternoon. My grandmother would serve wine and then some finger food. The wine was called pink taba. I think it was rosé. And even from the time we were little kids, we would all get like a little shot of pink taba, and the food was either a bowl of M&Ms or a bowl of cheese doodles. So we would, sit around, chat, have our wine, and then we'd go home. And then my mom would always have a real big Sunday dinner. It was always a roast, like a turkey, roast beef, or ham, or something. Or once in a while, she would make sort of Greek spaghetti, and the sauce was very Greek. It was very tomatoey, and instead of sausage or ground beef, she would basically simmer chuck steak. So it was like kind of this stringy meat, but it was again, very Greek. And then we would start, and my mom and dad would keep their church clothes on. So my dad was still in his shirt and tie. My mom was in her dress. I think we would change. We would start with doing the cross. We'd do our cross. We'd say our cross prayer, which was Ios Theos, Ios Iros, Ios Athanos, Leisnos. You do it 3 times, which means, Holy God, Holy Almighty, Holy Immortal, have mercy on us. And then we'd have dinner. It was nice. And then after dinner, that was the one time during the day on Sunday we could, if we wanted to, go out and play with our friends. But, dinner was over like 2, 3 o'clock, and we had maybe 2, 3 hours to play, and then it was back with the family. Around, 4 or 5 o'clock, we would all get together and then either get in the car and go to my grandmother's house or my aunt and uncle's house, or they would come to our house. And that was time when we would have, quote, coffee together. We'd get together again for the second time of the day. And that was at a time when it wasn't considered passé or like you were cutting corners if you served like an Entenmann's coffee cake or an Entenmann's chocolate cake or a Table Talk apple pie. This was the era of, those things were luxuries. That was the sign of the times. Like now you could actually get really good baked goods from the grocery store. So nowadays people would be like, you would never serve an Entenmann's, cake when you had company. But that's what we did. Once in a while, like I would say maybe once every couple months, for a special, super special treat, we would get pizza, before the dessert time. My mom and dad were both, they were, children of the Depression. My dad was born in 1925, my mom 1926. So they grew up during the Depression. And even, when they had us, the kids, we had our family, we didn't have a lot of money. But so they were ingrained this idea that, you did not spend money on extravagancies unless it was a special treat. And getting takeout food, even pizza, that was a big deal. So when we had pizza, we couldn't wait, It's not like nowadays, it's like, your kids are like, what's for dinner? Oh, we're having pizza again. No, this was awesome. So anyway, we would have our coffee, and like once in a while we would have our pizza. And then this was like the Greekiest Greek thing. And, at the time it was so cringy, but I look back on it with such fondness. So then we would, move all the furniture in the family room and the living room to the corners, and we put on a Greek record, and then we would all Greek dance. So Greek dancing, it's line dancing. It's like you kind of go around, and we would literally go from room to room and line dance, and it's like 1, 2, 3, kick, and they're different dances. And my brother, sister, and I kind of knew the simple ones, but. When Sunday afternoon was at our house, we would like close all the curtains. We thought like, man, if our friends ever saw us dancing around the house like that, they would have like given us the hardest time. But again, we knew it was like so dorky, but we had fun. Like we would laugh and it was nice. The Greek music was great. So that was pretty much like, every Sunday we did the Greek dancing. And then in the evening, this was the ritual. We would all sit in front of the TV and we would watch Ed Sullivan. And Ed Sullivan, like, the Sunday night Ed Sullivan show was like the highlight of the week. And he would get, amazing acts. The Beatles were on, and he had comedy acts and magicians and everything else. And we would sit by the TV. And that was through, I think Ed Sullivan, that show went through like 1971. And then after that, I think they would air reruns of, Jackie Gleason, The Honeymooners, and we watched that, and then, or other stuff. I remember one time, this was just classic of my dad. There was a football game on, and, the guys all wanted to watch football, and my Thea Mary, my Aunt Mary, and my mom, and I think my sister, wanted to watch something else. So my dad, to accommodate everybody, and, we couldn't watch TV in separate rooms. It was always together. So he moved the TV from his bedroom into the family room. So the two TVs were next to each other, the football game and then whatever my mom and aunt wanted to watch, sort of blasting volume. Nobody could hear anything. It was like this chaos. And I think, but again, it was so important that we were all sitting together watching TV together. So, that was our Sunday. I got to say, when I look back on it, oh my God, I would give anything just to relive one of those days. It was so fun. I mean, again, it was kind of cringy. We were hanging out with my grandmother, my aunt and uncle. But back then, as far as what was enjoyable, the bar was a lot lower. Like we didn't have 24-hour a day streaming of, videos and movies and, movies on demand and, inundated with little comedy quips and everything else online. And, we didn't have Spotify, like any song you can ever want, you can get in an instant. And we were required to spend time with the relatives, spend time with the family. And I look back on it and I just feel like as kids, we were happier. Again, the bar was set lower and, we had to kind of sit sometimes and listen to the parents talk. And, once in a while they would say, okay, guys, you can go play a board game now. But it was fun. It was very wholesome and we were together. It wasn't like we were all in separate rooms and, we were all like playing with our friends everywhere. Like at least on Sundays we were together and largely during the week. My wife and I, we had kids kind of late in life and I've tried my best to bring elements of that to my children. Like I drag them to church every Sunday, try to do the family meals. But, I got to say, sometimes it feels like, fighting an uphill battle given the culture that we're in nowadays. And I know every era has its ups, advantages and disadvantages, but like on balance, I think like, being a kid in the 60s and 70s and then a teenager was that was ideal. So that's it for now. If any of this resonated with you, if you enjoyed this video, please do hit the subscribe button. There's going to be, there will be many more videos like this coming in the future. So would love to have you be part of my community. And see you next time.